The beauty of the Pacific at dusk could have been almost cruel. Gray waves rolled through the bruised sky. A lone plane limped homeward across the water. A coughing engine trailed it back towards land.
Inside the cockpit, a young F4U pilot sat in the blackest darkness.
There had been no hint of the instruments. The windscreen offered nothing. He could not see the water. He could not see the ship. And yet, in some miraculous fashion, and to some unknown degree, he was to land on a stretch of water as narrow as a city block and as elusive as a mirage. What followed would go down in the history book as part of the legend of the Navy flyers, not because it ever should have worked in the first place. Long after America began prying into the Pacific in search of Japan in America's bid to end World War II, aircraft carriers had evolved into the pulse of the war. It was a floating airfield, a factory of violence and survival. It was a challenging environment that proved the difference between life and death was not necessarily in combat, it was making it back to the carrier. Carrier landings were perilous even under ideal conditions.
The deck was short.
The ship was moving. Wind, spray, and turbulence twisted the approach into a deadly puzzle. Pilots had seconds to align their aircraft correctly. Too high, and they slammed into the barrier cables. Too low, and they struck the ramp or vanished into the sea.
And that was in daylight.
With clear visibility. With working instruments. For the men who flew carrier aircraft, especially early in the war, landing was an art learned through bruises, close calls and funerals. Some airframes forgave mistakes.
Others did not.
The Vought F4U Corsair fell firmly into the latter category. The Corsair was one of the most formidable fighters of the war, and one of the most difficult to fly. Its massive engine and inverted gull wings gave it unmatched speed and climb, but also made carrier operations notoriously dangerous. The long nose obscured forward visibility during landing. The aircraft had a vicious tendency to bounce if the touchdown angle was even slightly wrong. Early in its service life, the Corsair earned a grim reputation aboard carriers, with landing accidents occurring at an alarming rate. So severe were the early problems that for a time, the Navy relegated the Corsair to land-based Marine squadrons, while the more forgiving Hellcat dominated carrier decks. But war has a way of forcing change. By 1944, the need for every capable aircraft was undeniable. Modifications were made. Training improved. The Corsair slowly returned to carrier service, now somewhat tamed, but still demanding respect. Every pilot knew, the Corsair did not forgive hesitation. And it certainly did not forgive blindness. According to historical records, the incident began like countless others, a routine combat air patrol over contested waters. The pilot, young, skilled, and already hardened by months of war, launched from his carrier with fuel, ammunition, and confidence.
Somewhere between takeoff and return, disaster struck.
Whether it was a mechanical failure, combat damage, or a malfunctioning cockpit system, the result was catastrophic. The pilot lost the ability to see. In some accounts, oil sprayed across the windscreen. In others, a combination of smoke, glare, and instrument failure rendered both vision and navigation nearly useless. What is certain is this: the Corsair was still flying, but the pilot inside it was effectively blind. Over open ocean, blindness was usually a death sentence.
Most carrier pilots flew by visual reference.
Even with basic instruments, landing required precise sight lines. A blind approach meant trusting voices on a radio, trusting mathematics and timing, trusting men you could not see, and trusting a ship you might never reach. The pilot considered his options.
Ditching was possible.
But ditching a Corsair was lethal more often than not. The long nose and heavy engine tended to dig into the water, flipping the aircraft violently. Survival rates were low. Bailing out was worse. At low altitude, over uncertain waters, with a carrier somewhere unseen, parachuting into the Pacific meant exposure, sharks, and the faint hope of rescue. There was only one real choice left. He turned back toward the carrier.
On the carrier, the mood shifted the moment the radio call came through. A blind Corsair.
Carrier landings relied on visual signals, hand flags, paddles, deck lights. Landing signal officers guided pilots with precise movements and eye contact. Radios were secondary. There was no established procedure for talking a completely blind pilot onto a deck.
The ship could not stop. It could only turn into the wind.
The pilot could not see the deck. He could only hear.
Deck crews froze.
Officers crowded the radio room. The landing signal officer, paddles tucked under his arm, stared out at the empty sky where a plane should have been. Somewhere out there, a Corsair circled blindly, fuel ticking down second by second. The decision was made quickly, because there was no time for debate. They would try. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of coordination in carrier aviation history. Using radio instructions alone, the ship's crew began guiding the pilot into position.
Bearings, altitude calls, airspeed corrections.
Every command had to be precise. Every instruction had to compensate for the lack of sight.
The pilot listened, hands steady on the controls, fighting vertigo and fear. Without visual reference, the inner ear lies.
The aircraft feels level when it isn't. It feels stable when it's descending. Trust became the only instrument left. As the Corsair lined up with the carrier's wake, the landing signal officer began calling adjustments. The deck crew stood ready, nets raised, crash teams in position. Silence fell across the ship except for the radio. This was not standard procedure. This was improvisation under fire. Carrier decks were measured in feet. Mistakes were measured in lives. Too far left, and the Corsair would shear its wing off on the island superstructure. Too far right, and it would miss the deck entirely. Too low, and it would clip the ramp. Too fast, and it would crash through the barriers. And the pilot could see none of it. Historical accounts describe the tension as nearly unbearable. Men held their breath. Some turned away. Others watched, unable to look anywhere else. The landing signal officer kept talking.
Easy, easy. Hold it there. The Corsair descended.
When the aircraft finally emerged from the haze, it was already too close for corrections.
The wheels struck the deck hard.
The plane bounced once, an eternity, and then slammed down again.
The resting hook caught a wire. The Corsair stopped.
For a split second, no one moved. Then the deck erupted. Men ran toward the aircraft, pounding the fuselage, shouting, laughing, some openly shaking. The pilot sat motionless in the cockpit, hands still locked on the controls, as if afraid that letting go might undo the miracle that had just occurred. He had landed blind.
On a carrier. In a Corsair.
The incident was not immediately publicized. Wartime censorship kept many such stories quiet. But among aviators, the tale spread quickly, becoming a symbol of trust, training, and the fragile line between life and death at sea. It raised questions that naval aviation would wrestle with for decades, about instrument flying, radio-controlled approaches, and the limits of human coordination under pressure. More than that, it reminded everyone involved of a simple truth: technology mattered, but people mattered more. Yet the story does not end on the deck. Because the landing was only the beginning of the consequences, investigations, and changes that followed. Changes that would reshape how pilots were trained, how carriers operated, and how future lives would be saved. And behind it all remained the image that haunted those who witnessed it: a single aircraft descending out of nothingness, guided only by voices, onto a strip of steel in the middle of a vast and unforgiving ocean. The Corsair sat silently on the deck, its engine ticking as it cooled. The pilot did not quickly exit his plane. Witnesses would forever remember what they saw. The pilot remained seated in his plane with his helmet still strapped to his head and his hands hanging limply on his thighs as if he had not been told that it was all over. The pilot certainly had not been told it was really over until someone got onto his plane and tapped on his canopy. His legs almost collapsed when he stood up. Carrier landings were always intense situations, but this had carved itself into the mind of every man who had ever seen it take place. For many, it would be the closest they would ever come to seeing a miracle take place at sea itself. However, miracles in a wartime scenario were not often left unquestioned. Below decks, the carrier returned to its rhythm. Aircraft were refueled. Guns were checked. Orders continued to flow. But beneath the routine, the incident was already rippling outward. The pilot was examined by the ship's medical officer. According to later accounts, he was dehydrated, exhausted, and shaking, not from injury, but from delayed shock. His eyes were swollen and irritated, streaked red from oil fumes and strain. He would later say that at several points during the approach, he had been convinced he was already dead and simply hadn't realized it yet. The officers wanted details. Exactly what had failed. How much vision had he really lost? At what point had he committed to the landing? The pilot struggled to answer. Some moments were sharp, almost painfully clear. The sound of the radio, the tone of the landing signal officer's voice. Other moments were missing entirely, swallowed by adrenaline and fear. "I just did what they told me," he reportedly said.
"I trusted them."
That simple statement would echo long after the war. Naval aviation had always depended on trust, but this incident exposed just how fragile that trust could be, and how powerful it was when it held.
Carrier pilots trusted the deck crews to clear the landing area in seconds.
They trusted the arresting wires to catch. They trusted that the ship would be exactly where it was supposed to be. And deck crews trusted pilots to hit their marks with deadly precision. What no one fully trusted, until moments like this, was the idea that a man could land a high-performance fighter without sight. Before the war, instrument-only carrier landings were considered impractical at best and suicidal at worst. Instruments could fail.
Radios could cut out.
And the margin for error was too small to rely on anything but eyesight and instinct. Yet here was proof, sitting quietly in the hangar bay, that under the right conditions, the impossible could be done. That realization unsettled some officers as much as it inspired others. The incident triggered an internal review. not a public inquiry, but a quiet examination by naval aviation authorities. They wanted to know whether this had been a one-in-a-million fluke or something that could be studied, learned from, and perhaps repeated. Landing signal officers were interviewed in detail. Their radio transcripts were reviewed. Every command was analyzed, timing, wording, tone. Even the emotional cadence of the voice was discussed. One conclusion stood out above all others. The calmness of the guidance had been as critical as its accuracy. Had the voice on the radio wavered, rushed, or betrayed doubt, the pilot might have panicked. Had too many voices spoken at once, confusion would have set in. Instead, there had been clarity, one voice, one authority, one steady stream of information. It was not just flying skill that saved the pilot. It was human connection. For the Corsair itself, the incident added a strange footnote to an already complicated legacy. By this point in the war, the aircraft had proven itself in combat beyond doubt. Its speed and firepower made it deadly in skilled hands. But among carrier pilots, its reputation was still mixed. Some loved it, others feared it. The blind landing didn't change the Corsair's quirks. It didn't make it easier to land. But it did something more subtle. It reframed how pilots thought about the machine. If a Corsair could be brought aboard without sight, then perhaps the aircraft was not just a dangerous beast, it was also a tool capable of extraordinary precision when pilot and crew worked as one. That idea mattered. Because the war was far from over, and the demands on carrier aviation were only increasing. For every extraordinary survival story, there were dozens that ended differently. Throughout the Pacific campaign, hundreds of pilots were lost not to enemy fire, but to landing accidents, ditchings, and mechanical failures. Many never even reached the point where a blind landing might have been attempted. The pilot who landed blind carried that knowledge with him. According to later recollections, he struggled with a quiet guilt, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he knew how easily luck could have turned against him. He had been guided home by voices. Others had not. That awareness would stay with him long after the war, shaping how he spoke about the incident. He never described it as heroism. He described it as survival, and as something that belonged as much to the men on the deck as it did to him. In the months that followed, the Navy began experimenting more seriously with improved instrument training and radio-guided approaches. These efforts were cautious and incremental, shaped by the understanding that no technology could yet replace the human eye on a pitching deck. But the seed had been planted. What if future pilots could rely more on instruments? What if carriers could guide aircraft through fog, smoke, or darkness? What if fewer men had to die simply because they couldn't see? Those questions would not be fully answered until decades later, with the development of advanced landing systems and radar-guided approaches. But the roots of that thinking stretched back to moments like this one. Moments where necessity forced innovation, and courage forced trust. Among pilots, the tale spread the way such stories always do. Over coffee in ready rooms, in hushed conversations before missions. Details changed slightly with each telling, but the core remained the same.
A Corsair. A blind pilot. A carrier deck in the middle of the Pacific.
Some saw it as proof that training worked. Others saw it as proof that luck ruled all things. Most saw it as a reminder that survival in war often depended on the calm voices of others when your own senses failed you. For young pilots just arriving in theater, the story carried a quiet message: you were never truly alone up there. Not as long as someone was listening on the other end of the radio. The carrier that had witnessed the blind landing did not pause its operations. Within hours, aircraft were launching again, climbing into the same sky that had nearly claimed one of their own. The pilot returned to flying after a period of recovery. He did not seek attention. He did not request reassignment. He flew, as so many did, because the war demanded it. Yet every landing after that carried a different weight. Each time his wheels touched the deck, he remembered what it felt like not to see it at all. Unlike famous battles or celebrated aces, this incident never became a headline. It lived in logbooks, oral histories, and the memories of those who had been there. But its legacy was real.
It demonstrated the power of discipline under pressure, the importance of clear communication.
And the fact that even in a war defined by machines, victory and survival still came down to human trust. In the next part of this story, we'll follow how moments like this shaped the future of carrier aviation, and how the lessons learned from one blind landing echoed into the jet age, changing how pilots would come home from war forever. Long after the Corsair was wheeled into the hangar bay and the deck scrubbed clean of oil and tire marks, the landing lingered in quieter places, inside conversations, inside decisions, inside the minds of men who would shape the future of naval aviation. Wars are often remembered through explosions and victories. But progress in war is more often forged in moments like this: isolated, terrifying, unrepeatable events that force institutions to confront their assumptions. The blind landing did exactly that. At the time, U.S. naval doctrine was conservative by necessity. Every change carried risk, and risk meant lives. The carrier fleet had been built around visual flying, daylight operations, clear weather whenever possible, and strict limits on what pilots were asked to attempt. But the Pacific War did not always respect doctrine. Fog rolled in without warning. Smoke from battle obscured decks. Night operations became unavoidable as the tempo of combat increased. And as carriers pushed closer to enemy-held islands, pilots were often returning damaged, low on fuel, or physically impaired. The blind Corsair landing forced planners to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Navy needed a better way to bring pilots home when sight failed. Not a replacement for visual landings, but a backup. Instrument flying was not new. Army Air Forces pilots had relied on it extensively over land. But carriers introduced unique complications. A runway on land didn't move. A carrier did. Pitch, roll, and yaw transformed every approach into a constantly shifting equation. Early aircraft instruments were crude by modern standards, gyroscopic, prone to drift, and easily damaged. Radios were short-range and unreliable. Still, aviation engineers and training officers began asking new questions. What if pilots trained more aggressively for partial or complete loss of vision? What if radio procedures were standardized, not improvised? What if landing signal officers were trained not just to signal, but to speak pilots down? The blind landing did not answer those questions, but it made ignoring them impossible. Perhaps no group was more affected by the incident than the landing signal officers themselves. LSOs were already under immense pressure. They stood exposed on the deck, inches from spinning propellers and roaring engines, guiding aircraft that could kill them instantly if something went wrong. Their judgment calls were final. Their mistakes were fatal. After the blind landing, their role expanded, at least conceptually. They were no longer just visual guides. They were potential lifelines through sound alone. Training manuals began emphasizing radio discipline.
One voice only.
Clear phrasing.
Emotional control.
LSOs were taught to modulate tone, not just content, because panic, even when subtle, could transmit instantly over the radio. This was not theory. It had been proven under fire. For the pilot at the center of the story, the aftermath was quieter and more complicated. Historical accounts suggest he was deeply affected by the experience, though he rarely spoke about it publicly. Fellow aviators noticed small changes. He was more methodical, more deliberate in his pre-flight checks, less casual about risk. He had seen how quickly control could vanish. Psychologists would later describe this as a classic response to near-death trauma: heightened awareness, sharpened discipline, and a deepened sense of responsibility. In wartime, such changes were both a burden and a gift. The pilot continued flying missions. He did not become reckless.
Nor did he become timid.
Instead, he carried the memory like a compass, always pointing him toward caution without fear. That balance saved lives, his and others. The blind Corsair landing was rare, but it was not entirely unique. As the war progressed, there were other near-blind recoveries: pilots with shattered canopies, smoke-filled cockpits, night approaches guided by radio alone.
Not all succeeded.
Some aircraft clipped the ramp.
Some missed the wires.
Some vanished into the black water behind the ship. Each attempt reinforced the same lesson: talking a pilot down was possible, but only barely, and only under the best conditions. Those failures were not hidden. They were studied quietly, their details fed back into training and procedure. Aviation advances not through triumph alone, but through catalogued loss. By late 1944 and into 1945, the Navy began experimenting with primitive landing aids. Improved deck lighting systems were installed to help pilots judge altitude and alignment at night. Radar technology advanced rapidly, though its integration into landing procedures lagged behind combat applications. The idea of fully radar-controlled landings remained distant. The technology was bulky, imprecise, and not yet trustworthy enough to replace a human eye. Still, the direction was clear. The future would not rely solely on what pilots could see. One of the most enduring lessons of the blind landing was not technical, it was social. A carrier was not just a ship. It was a self-contained world, where pilots, deck crew, engineers, medics and officers depended on each other in ways that blurred rank and role. When the Corsair landed blind, it was not one man who succeeded. It was the radio operator who maintained a clear channel, the LSO who spoke calmly, the deck crew who prepared for disaster without hesitation, the ship's officers who trusted instinct over procedure. War often celebrates individuals, but moments like this reveal the truth: survival at sea was collective. As the Pacific War approached its final phase, carrier operations intensified.
Strikes grew larger.
Missions grew longer. The margin for error narrowed even further.
Pilots flew until exhaustion.
Carriers launched and recovered aircraft around the clock. Night landings, once rare, became routine. The memory of the blind Corsair landing hovered in the background, unspoken but understood. It served as both inspiration and warning.
Yes, it could be done.
But it should never be required. When the war ended, many of its most valuable lessons risked being forgotten in the rush toward peace. Demobilization scattered pilots and crews. Aircraft were scrapped, carriers mothballed. But naval aviation did not reset to zero. Instead, it carried forward stories, informal, human records of what had worked when doctrine failed. The blind landing was one of those stories. It resurfaced in training anecdotes,
In safety briefings,
in the quiet advice older pilots gave younger ones: trust your crew,
trust your voice,
and never assume you'll always be able to see. In the years that followed, jets replaced propellers.
speeds increased.
Landing margins shrank even further. Carrier aviation became faster, louder, and more unforgiving. Ironically, these changes made instrument landing systems not just desirable but essential. Radar-guided approaches,
Optical landing systems,
automated glide slope indicators. Eventually, fully integrated electronic landing aids transformed carrier recoveries. But even as technology advanced, the core principle remained unchanged. At the heart of every safe landing, whether guided by lights, radar, or computers, was communication. The blind Corsair landing had proven that long before the machines caught up. Today, carrier pilots train extensively for degraded visibility, instrument failures, and emergency recoveries. Modern systems are astonishingly precise.
Yet instructors still tell stories from the past, not as nostalgia,
as warning. Because no system is infallible. No instrument is immune to failure. And when everything goes dark, what remains is trust, between pilot and crew, between voice and listener. The Corsair pilot who landed blind did not intend to make history. He simply wanted to live. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy far larger than he ever imagined. In the final part of this documentary, we'll step back and reflect on what this moment tells us about courage, survival, and the fragile line between chaos and control in the age of war at sea. Decades later, long after the Pacific War faded into black and white photographs and museum placards, the story still surfaced, usually in quiet rooms, spoken softly by men who understood what it truly meant. Not because it was dramatic,
but because it was honest.
War does not preserve itself neatly. It leaves behind fragments, after-action reports, flight logs, grainy footage, and stories passed from one generation to the next.
Some events become legend.
Others survive only because a few people refuse to let them vanish. The blind Corsair landing lived in that fragile space. It was not attached to a famous name. It did not alter the course of a battle. There were no medals specifically awarded for it. And yet, among naval aviators, it endured. Because it represented something they all feared. And something they all hoped for. Pilots like to believe that skill is everything. That training, discipline, and reflexes determine survival. And to a large extent, that is true. But every aviator also knows the other truth, that survival often depends on circumstances beyond control.
A gust of wind.
A wire that holds, or doesn't. A radio that stays alive just long enough. The blind landing stripped away the illusion that mastery alone was enough. The pilot did everything right, but if any single link in the chain had failed, the outcome would have been fatal. That understanding bred humility. And humility in aviation saves lives. Courage in war is often portrayed as action, charging forward, attacking, pushing through fear. But the courage displayed during the blind landing was quieter, more restrained.
It was
the courage to admit over the radio, "I can't see." The courage of the landing signal officer to accept responsibility for another man's life. The courage of the deck crew to prepare for catastrophe without panic.
No one shouted. No one grandstanded.
They simply did their jobs, calmly, precisely, together. That is the kind of courage that rarely makes headlines. Little is known about the later life of the pilot himself, and that absence feels appropriate.
He did not seek fame.
He did not tour lecture circuits. Like many veterans, he carried his most intense experiences privately, sharing them only with those who could truly understand. If he ever reflected on the landing later in life, it was likely not as a triumph, but as a reminder. A reminder of how close he had come to the edge, and of how someone else had pulled him back. Modern naval aviators train with systems that wartime pilots could scarcely imagine.
Precision landing radars, heads-up displays,
automated approaches that calculate descent rates down to fractions of a degree. Yet instructors still emphasize the basics. Listen clearly.
Speak calmly. Trust the process. Trust each other.
Because when everything fails, and history shows that eventually, something always does, those basics are all that remain. The blind Corsair landing did not teach the Navy how to land without sight. It taught the Navy how to think when sight was gone. Stories endure not because they are extraordinary, but because they reveal something true. This one reveals that war is not only about firepower and strategy. It is about human beings operating at the edge of their limits, relying on one another in moments where there is no margin for error. It reminds us that survival is rarely solitary, and that sometimes, the most important thing a man can do in war is simply keep his voice steady. Somewhere in the Pacific, long ago, a carrier turned into the wind. The deck was ready.
The radio was open.
And a man who could not see trusted voices he could not touch.
The Corsair descended. And against all odds, it came home.
That is not just a story about aviation. It is a story about trust, spoken into the dark, and answered by steel, courage, and calm.